Well, if you would take your Bibles and open them to Genesis chapter 8. Genesis chapter 8. While you're turning there, let me let you know that I forgot one of the announcements, which we're not surprised about at all. But I failed to mention that this Thursday is seniors, and so sort of out of the habit of that. Need to get back in the swing of things, I suppose. 11:30 is seniors, and they always have a great time. We have a banana pudding army. Maybe that's the way to say it. I don't know. We have just a group, maybe, I don't know, that puts together a great banana pudding. We have every time. We just have a good time at seniors this Thursday, 11:30. Whether you think you're a senior or not, if you are retired, if you can get a senior coffee at Bojangles, then you are invited to come join us at 11:30 on seniors. Let's see. I think Linda's next door. Linda, shout real loud so I can hear you who the guest is. I'm not hearing you, Linda. We'll just go with it. Somebody great. But I'll put it on the call around on Wednesday, and then I'll also remind you on Wednesday about seniors. All right, Genesis chapter 8. And we're going to be finishing up our passage from last week. This is what I didn't get to show you last week. There's no sermon notes because we've already done the passage, and I think just the real important part, God remembered Noah. We covered that last time, but we're going to be finishing up the message, so to speak, by looking at some things that we would expect to see in the world around us, given the reality of the flood of Noah. And I hope it'll be interesting to you. We've done this before. We're doing it this morning. We've got one more time we're going to do that when we get off the ark. 8 people are going to walk off the ark, and that's something that we should be able to see in human history, and we're indeed going to do that. We're going to be looking at that later on in chapter 8. But so we got this. If you like this kind of thing, you got one more to look forward to. If you hate it, you got to endure one more after this. So either way, you're going to have one more as we come towards the end of Genesis chapter 8. But for this morning, we're at the opening part of Genesis 8, and we're going to reread verses 1 through 5 and think about them and what the implications are that we would expect to see in the world around us. And hopefully this will be a helpful thing to you. So Genesis chapter 8 and verse number 1, it says, "Then God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the animals that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were also stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. And the waters receded continually from the earth. At the end of the 150 days, the waters decreased. Then the ark rested in the 7th month, the 17th day of the month, on the mountains of Ararat. And the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen." Well, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Our Father, indeed, we do thank you for all the great privileges we enjoy as Americans. We thank you also, Father, for the liberty that we have in the Lord Jesus Christ. We ask, O Lord, that as we come to study your word, that our eyes would be opened, our hearts would be enlightened, and that we would be challenged today to live knowing that we live in a passing world, that we are but strangers and pilgrims here, that heaven is our ultimate home. Help us to live and lay up treasure in heaven. We ask these things, for we pray in Jesus' precious name. Amen. Well, this morning we're going to be looking at some things in our natural world. We're going to be looking at God's world, and we're going to be seeing some evidences of the flood. And I want to remind you of something I told you 2 weeks ago. I think it bears remembrance. That evidence proves nothing. I'm going to show you some evidence today, but evidence by itself doesn't prove anything. It has to fit a narrative. It has to be interpreted. It has to be explained and understood. And I think that's an important thing for us to remember, because we have a tendency in our world. We live in a very childish culture, and I'm not sure if it's because of entertainment or politics, or maybe both. Often politics is entertainment, but we live in a culture that acts very childish, where if you look at the same evidence I am, and if you interpret it different than me, then the problem is you are an evil, terrible person, and you are my enemy. Now, that's the way children act, and that's okay on the elementary playground for that to be that way. That's how little children are. But we're not on the elementary playground. We are, although I saw some of you eyeing the slip and slide and wanting to go down it. That's the inner child in you wanted to come out. That's okay. But we're not like that. We are responsible adults. And if people look at the same evidence as us and they have a different interpretation than us, that's okay. They are not our enemies. We do not count them as evil people or whatever like that. We understand evidence does not prove anything. We interpret evidence in the light of our presupposition, in the light of the narrative that we understand to be true. And even though we as Christians often feel like the world treats us negatively, and the world treats us as if we're the ones who are terribly wrong because of our interpretation of the evidence, we are not allowed to reciprocate. I want to notice, if and Calvin, go ahead and turn the projector on. I want you to remind you of what Jesus said in the Golden Rule. You remember the Golden Rule, don't you? Not exactly a quote from the Sermon on the Mount, but pretty close. Jesus said, "Do unto others, not as they do unto you, but as you would have them do unto you." You want to treat other people the way you want to be treated. And we as Christians certainly want to be given a fair hearing, and we should do the same for others. And those who believe differently than us, those who believe maybe even in atheistic evolution, they are brilliant people sometimes, and they love their families, and they might be good neighbors and all those kinds of things. But where they're wrong is not in the brilliance of their analysis of the evidence. Where they're wrong is in their presupposition, and we need to understand that. And we also need to understand that there is no human conspiracy to hide the deficiencies of evolution. Evolution is stronger than ever, I would say. There's no human conspiracy. There is a conspiracy, but it's not human at all. In fact, the conspiracy comes from the God of this age, who blinds the minds of those who believe not. There is a conspiracy, but it's not among people. I want to remind you, Ephesians 6:12 says, "We do not wrestle against flesh and blood." Who are the flesh and bloods? We are. That's not where the battle is. We do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. That's where the battle lies. And if there is a battle, and if there is wrongness, it comes from presupposition and how people interpret the evidence. I just want to remind you of that, because we live in a world where people have forgotten that, and people think you have to agree 100% with them or we can't be friends at all. I think we as Christians should be the model of understanding that is not true, that is not so at all. I also want to remind you, as we think about these things, that it is a spiritual warfare, but I also want to remind you that as we set forth the evidence and as we compare the different interpretations, I do think that our answers are the best. I'm very objective, aren't I? No, I'm very biased about that. I am not objective at all. But as I'm going to lay out for you, I don't have time to lay out everybody else's theories about how the evidence fits together. But as I lay it out, I think if you took an objective look, that in the majority of cases, not all, but in the majority of cases, our answer makes the most sense. It follows the rules of logic, and it follows Ockman's dictum that the simplest answer that explains all the data is most likely correct. I think that maybe it's not always true. You say, well, what areas is it not true in? I'm not going to tell you. How's that sound? I'm going to keep that one to myself. There's a lot of challenges left. There's a lot of things that we need to understand. That's the way science works. We're always learning. I want to remind you about that as well. But I do think that we have not just answers. We as Christians have often the best answer. I'll just give you a couple of examples. This is the Kingston Mountain Range out in California. The pictures are by the Bureau of Land Management. By the way, I'm swiping them. I guess that's okay. It's a government picture archive of the Kingston Mountain Range. You say, big deal about that. Well, here's the big deal about the Kingston Mountain Range. It's a mountain range that has no roots, none at all. You know, mountains aren't just sitting on top of the ground. They actually go below ground as well. This mountain range has no roots. It's just sitting on top of the ground. They think they found the roots of the Kingston Mountain Range 60 miles away. Now, let me ask you, what would pick up a mountain range, carry it 60 miles, and dump it off? What would explain that? Or it might be vibrated across. It's hard to say, come up with possibilities. But who has the best explanation of that? Uniformitarianism or the catastrophe the Bible talks about in Noah's flood? That's just an example. I think that our answer fits the evidence best. That's not to say that there's somebody who would look at that same mountain and come up with a different answer, but ours fits it best. Well, ours is based on what we can see in the present day. This this is a canyon called Engineers Canyon. Not the best picture of it, but I wanted you to see that there is a river at the bottom of it. I don't know if you can see that. You can't see my laser pointer next door, but maybe you can see it here. There's a lazy river meandering through Engineers Canyon. And I ask you, how would you interpret this canyon? Well, is it that the river formed the canyon, or did the canyon form the river? Well, under normal circumstances, we don't have any idea. But I can tell you how Engineers Canyon was formed. Anybody alive in 1982 can tell you, because that canyon was formed in 9 hours. You might remember Mount St. Helens that blew in 1980. In 1982, a mudslide came off of it and formed Engineers Canyon in 9 hours. The river didn't form the canyon formed the river. This is another canyon, again, in March, something about March, I guess. It was formed in March 1926. In 6 days, that canyon was formed right there. Now, the critic would say that those canyons are nowhere near the size of the massive canyons we see like in Grand Canyon. And I agree with that 100%. But I got to tell you, the catastrophes that caused them is nowhere near the size of Noah's flood. No, as bad as Mount St. Helens was, it doesn't even compare on the order of magnitude with what happened in Noah's flood. And so we could expect the evidence to be left over, not to compare. But we use what we see in the present to help us the catastrophes we see in the present to help us to understand the past. Now, with that said, as we think about Noah's flood, I want to remind you that Noah's flood is not just a bunch of water. When we think about Noah's flood, we normally we think about the ark and the animals and the rainbow. That's what we think about. But if we think about the catastrophe at all, we think mainly or not primarily or only about the water. That water showed up and it was above the mountains and water disappeared, and that's the end of it as far as we're concerned. But that's not the way Noah's flood worked at all. Noah's flood, when God set off Noah's flood, when the fountains of the deep burst open, when the windows of heaven opened up and everything came pouring down, that was the beginning of a catastrophe. These reverberations are felt even into the present day. It's the scientific principle of isostasy. Now, let me just see if I can explain that. They usually use an ice cube, but seeing that it's summertime, it's everybody going to the beach weather on July 4th, let me just use a beach ball. If you go to the beach or the lake or the swimming pool, whatever you like to go to the water, and you take a beach ball in there, and by your human intervention, you hold the beach ball down underwater, and then you let it go, what happens to the beach ball? 5 people know what happens. That is outstanding. I'm so glad that this illustration is working so very well. Does the beach ball come up to the exact position where it normally wants to be at rest? And let's make the beach ball sort of human, okay? The beach ball wants to be at a specific place in the water. But what happens when you let it go is it shoots way past that place. And then it comes down. And then it comes up. And then it comes down. And then it just goes like this. And it bobs in the water till it finally comes to rest at the right place. That's isostasy. That's what happened in the flood. When God launched the flood, it began a series of motions that had to work itself out, and the reverberations are felt even down into this day. You've got to keep that in the back of your mind as we look at what happened in the flood. Okay, everybody with me? Let's look at what happened. Just a couple things here this morning. We can't go through everything, but let's look first of all in verse number 1. It says, "Then God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the animals that were with him on the ark." Let's just stop right there and remind ourselves that's the main thing I want you to get. I want you to get that God does not forget his people. That's what the passage is trying to tell you. But in addition, we have some more information. "And God," it says, "made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters subsided." Now, what exactly this means is hard to tell. Remember, the word wind is the word ruach, and it can mean spirit, it can mean breath, it can mean all those things. In my mind, what I see immediately is Moses. I forgot to mention this to you. What we see in the flood is we could just mark a geological intensity with respect to the flood. After the flood begins, we have this real intense period of isostasy as the beach ball is flopping up and down, and then it smooths out to the present. I forgot to mention that to you. But when I think about the wind, I think about Moses at the Red Sea. In Exodus chapter 14, verse 21, it says, "Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind." Same word, ruach, all that night, and made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. That's what I see in my mind, but I don't know if that's exactly correct. You might notice in verse number 1, the last word of verse 1 in the New King James Version is the word subsided. If you have the King James, you might notice it's the word assuaged. And I wonder if the King James doesn't have the better idea here. The New King James always translates this word, shawak. It translates it as subsided, but I'm not sure that's right. On this page here, I show you how it's also used, how it's translated in other places. For example, in the book of Esther, it's translated 2 different ways. It's translated by the word word appease. In Esther chapter 2, verse 1, after these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, same exact word. And then over here in chapter 7, it's translated pacified. Hung a fellow on the gallows, Haman hung him on the gallows, and the king's wrath was pacified. And that's really the idea of the word. And so I think maybe what Jesus, when he calmed the storm, maybe that's even a better idea of what happened to the sea. In Mark 4:39, when there was a great storm, it says, then he arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, peace be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. That's really the idea. Noah's on the ark, and the ark is in the waters of the flood are just violent. There's moving, there's swift waters, and God sent a wind, or God sent His Spirit, or God sent His breath, and it assuaged, it subsided, it appeased, it pacified the waters. And that implies the waters were moving at a pretty good clip. What would we expect to see if there was a global flood with the waters moving at a pretty good clip? Let me just suggest three things to you, okay? Number one, I think we would see global water-laid sediment layers. That's what we would see. At least transcontinental, but perhaps global water-laying sedimentary layers if the world was covered by an ocean with a current, all right? Do we see that? You better believe it. Welcome to the lithostratigraphic column. There is a column that no matter where you go in this globe, as you dig down into the rocks and you see where you're at, you could go anywhere else in the globe and you could find a layer that matches the layer where you are. Now let me just say this, that the layers aren't always the same thickness. Some are more thick, some are more thin. The layers, there might be a missing one here or missing one there, but there is a global lithostratigraphic column. For example, 2 weeks ago I showed you a fish within a fish. You remember that? That came from Kansas, and the chalk beds in Kansas. That is the same chalk bed that's in England as the White Cliffs of Dover. It's the same chalk bed that's in France that our Rangers climbed on Normandy. It's the same chalk bed that's in Israel. It is a global strata column. The same columns that exist all the way across the globe. They are uniform. They are thick. That is unlike anything we see today. As we see layers created today in the sedimentary layers, they are local, they are regional, and they are very thin. These are thick, massive layers that occur all the way across the globe, across continents. It is absolutely amazing. We see what we would expect to see. Secondly, we see a current that moves as we would think the current would move. How do you tell current in sedimentary layers? It's by cross-bedding and other evidence that's left behind. If you study geology, you can figure out what the current was when the sedimentary layer was laid down, and we see a global current. Now, let me just ask you, what direction do you think that current would be? Anybody got any ideas? Anybody think about this? I would like to pretend I'm the one who came up with this. I'm not. But since that person's not around here, I'm going to claim I came up with it because you don't even know, you don't know the difference. I'm going to say my brilliance. I figured all this out. What would be the global current if there was a global flood? Well, it would be east to west. How do I know that? What is it that wants to hold, let's humanize the moon. Oh, I just told you the answer, didn't I? Oh man, I'm a bad teacher. What is it? What does the moon want to do with water? It wants to, the gravitational pull wants to hold it still while the earth rotates underneath the water. Now normally it can't do that because it comes up against the continental crust and we see the effect as tide. But with no continents, with no landmass there at all, with the water free to move, what would it appear like? It would appear as a current. As the moon holds the water in one place and the earth rotates underneath it, you would see evidence of a current from east to west. Guess what we find in all the flood layers, from the Banded Iron Formation all the way up into the chalk layer? Guess what current we see in the sedimentary layers? It is east to west across not just North America, but across the globe, just like we would expect if there were a global flood. But my favorite is that the layers are laminated. Let me just show you a couple of pictures of laminated layers. These are from out west, because out west you don't have anything to get in the way of seeing the layers. These are just a couple of examples of the layer, and you see how beautiful that layering is. That is called lamentation. There's the wave that's out there out west. Beautiful lamentation of the layers. How do you get laminated layers? Because today we don't. There is no laminate. We don't see lamination persisting today. If a hurricane comes through and it dumps a bunch of sand out, it will be laminated for a very short time. But if you go back 1 year later, you will not find any lamination. Why? Because in the modern world, we have critters that bury all down in there and they mess up the lamination. lamination. They get all in there and they dig and they do all that kind of stuff. And what happens if you let a bunch of boys in a room where everything's laid out beautiful? What happens? The beauty goes away. It all goes into chaos, right? That's what happens. These beautiful laminated layers get all messed up. There's only one place in the modern world where we see the laminated layers persisting, and that place is a place where there are no critters. That place is called the Dead Sea. And guess why they call it the Dead Sea? Because there ain't nothing living. There's no living life there at all. The only way for laminated layers to persist that we can think of, besides the fact that there's no critters, and by the way, we know there's critters because their fossils are found in those sedimentary layers. What's the only other way is for the layers to be laid down so quickly, so rapidly, that there was no time for what's called bioturbation. That is, the animals to get in there and mix it up. It had to be laid down in a very rapid fashion, which, by the way, helps explain why we see polystrate items. That is a tree that's going vertically up through the layers. How long did you think it took those layers to lay down? They laid down very rapidly around that polystrate fossil is what it's called. Now, again, everybody believes that. It's not that I'm showing you evidence that nobody believes. Everybody knows that's exactly what happened. Everybody knows that a catastrophe caused that. It's just, why did the catastrophe come? We all see the exact same evidence, but it is exactly as the Bible describes. There is a global sedimentary layer. The current move from east to west. The layers display lamination, which shows that they happen very rapidly, just as we would get from the Bible. But that's not all. Let's look on in verse number 2. It says, the fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were also stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained, and the waters receded continually from the earth. At the end of 150 days, the waters decreased. Now, how did that happen? Well, we have a little commentary on this in Psalm 104. In Psalm 104, verse 5, it says, praising the Lord, you, that is God, who laid the foundations of the earth so that it should not be moved forever. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. That's during the flood. At your rebuke, they fled. At the voice of your thunder, they hastened away. They went up over the mountains. They went down into the valleys, that is the ocean basins, to the place which you founded for them. You have set a boundary that they may not pass over, that they may not return to cover the earth. So you have all this water. It's all mixed up all over the globe, and now it's all receding down to the ocean basins. What does that tell us about our world? Well, it tells us, first of all, the oceans at that moment would be very warm. They would be warm from lava coming up. They would be warm from the fountains of the great deep being burst open, all that hot water coming into it, and they'd all be mixed up. The Arctic Ocean would have been just as warm as on the equator. You would be able to swim in the Arctic Ocean if you were so willing at that time. Probably a bad idea. Probably a lot of bacteria there, but anyway, you could have done it. The Arctic Ocean was very warm. What does that tell us about? It tells us about the coming of the Ice Age. Now, remember that I told you about how conventional theory, there's a lot of brilliant people who just interpret the data a little bit different than us, and they come up with conventional theories. Well, forget all of that when you come to the Ice Age, because there is no conventional theory which explains the Ice Age. There are 60 different theories about how the Ice Age came about. 60. Only the extinction of dinosaurs has more. It's got about 100. The Ice Age has about 60 theories. There is no conventional theory which explains the mechanism by which the Ice Age is caused. If you go on NASA's website today, they will say that the leading theory is the astronomical theory, and what that postulates is that it goes along with the Milankovitch cycles. There's cycles in the orbit of our Earth around the sun. About every 100,000 years, the variance changes, and what they say is they identify that the Ice Age must have come with the Milankovitch cycle, so that you have a 100,000-year Ice Age, and then you have a 10,000-year interglacial period, and that's how they explain it. The problem is when they try to make it work, it can't. What do you need to have an Ice Age? Well, the winters are already cold enough. They are. What about the summers? Are summers cool enough to have an Ice Age? No. The average temperature in the summer would have to drop by 50 degrees Fahrenheit at a minimum to have an Ice Age. At a minimum. It needs to grow up lower than that if you have sun available, because in Antarctica, ice can melt even at 14 degrees Fahrenheit because of the sun. So you need something to block the sun. We'll get to what that is in just a minute. But you need at least 50 degrees cooler Fahrenheit on the continents. What happens if you all of a sudden drop the temperature 50 degrees? What happens to the air around you? It gets a lot drier. drier. Did you notice that during the winter, you have a lot more static electricity? You may need your clothes are more staticky. The air is a lot drier in the winter because that's what happens. If you have that cool air, you do not get the precipitation to bring the snow, so you don't have any ice pack to begin with. There is no mechanism that we know of in conventional theory to launch an ice age. They've tried. By the way, I meant to tell you, how do we know there's ice ages? We see the evidence of them. There's you can see lateral moraines and terminal moraines to tell you that there is an ice age. There's the ice age where it covered the earth. We'll come back to that map in just a second. But when they made computer models to try to figure out how, I want you to notice, by the way, that up here on the map, Alaska, fiddle faddle, I've missed my laser. Up there in Alaska and Siberia and all those places, there are no glaciers. There is no ice age up there in those regions. We'll talk about that in a minute. But when they did the computer models and tried to make glaciation, they said this: Siberia, Alaska, and the Yukon, including the lowlands, were among the first to glaciate in the model. That's the computer model. We now have glaciation, but what's the problem? But mainly outside the area where it existed during the last ice age. Now, the first ice age was this one, after the fall. Is everybody aware of this ice age? That's the first ice age. But we're talking about this one. How did the ice age come about? Well, the Bible provides the two clues. What's the two things you need? First of all, you need a lot of volcanoes going off because you got to have particles in the air which can block the sun, because the sun is what melts the ice. You got to have that. But at the same time, as you're having cooler continents, you also have to have very warm oceans, up to 80 degrees warm. The ocean has to be, because you've got to have a lot of evaporation. And as the ocean produces a lot of evaporation, when the evaporated water hits the coolness of the continents, what happens? It comes down in storm. And so you have a lot of snow. You need warm, really warm oceans. You need really cool continents. And the only way you get that is from Noah's flood. And that's why we have up here, we have bison and horse fossils. We have the woolly mammoths and stuff up here. We're eating grass, not tundra. They're eating grass. How could that be? The oceans were very warm following the flood, while the continents were very cool. And that ice age, by the way, we continue to feel the presence coming out of the ice age. Probably lasted perhaps around 700 years. And ever since then, we've been sort of, remember our beach ball, we've been bouncing back and forth. So around the year 1000, we had a heat wave that covered all of the continents. In Great Britain, they had vineyards. It was so hot. That heat wave lasted about 500 years. In the 1400s, from 1400 to 1880, we had a cool wave. It was called the Little Ice Age. And the glaciers, there were no new glaciers. There was not an actual ice age, but the glaciers advanced. All the glaciers advanced. And now since 1880, we're back into a heat wave. And that brings up a question, the question of climate change. Now, I would rather clean the bathrooms with my tongue than talk about climate change in church. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, because the Bible is silent on it, okay? Absolutely silent. There is nothing said, and so I would be foolish to get up here and preach a sermon about climate change. But I do want to make you aware of a couple of things. Is there climate change? The answer is yes. We were in an ice age. Anybody think we're in an ice age anymore? No, if you think so, go out Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of this week, and it's going to be 95, 100 degrees is what it's going to be. We are not in an ice age. We were, and now we're not. So, of course, there is climate change. The question in climate change is, what contributions do humans make? The Industrial Revolution, maybe that's more precise. What contributions does the Industrial Revolution make? And we as Christians, I think, should be very careful. For the most part, we need to keep our mouth shut, because the Bible, once again, is silent on this matter. Now, we know that there are extremists, and I noticed this, and so I saved this. Back last year, Glacier National Park was forced to take down their signs. They had signs saying the glaciers would be gone by 2020. They took them down last year. You know why they took them down? Because the glaciers weren't gone. In fact, they have gotten bigger. Now, that's no sign of anything. Glaciers surge back and forth. That's how they do. And so they don't take that as a sign of anything. But there's the sign. It says goodbye to the glaciers, because if human-caused climate change, all the glaciers will be gone by 2020. That, of course, is not true. But I got to tell you, glaciers are receding. There's where they were in 1890, and you see where they are today. So again, we're getting warmer. The question is not, are we getting warmer? The question is, what's normal? Remember our beach ball. What is going back to normal? Is this caused by, is it getting worse because of humans, or is it just the beach ball bouncing back and forth and getting normal? I don't want to give the answer to that, because I don't actually know the answer. We do need to not fall into faulty thinking. NASA, on their climate page, says that all the climate change is human cause. Why? Because they buy into the astronomical theory. This is the end of this page right here. The final paragraph says, finally, Earth is currently in an interglacial period, a period of milder climate between ice ages. If there were no human influences on climate, scientists say, Earth's current orbital positions within the Milankovitch cycles predict our planet should be cooling, not warming, continuing a long-term cooling trend that began 6,000 years ago, and that's baloney. There is no connection. There is none that they can identify. There is no way to know what we should be at. That is faulty thinking. But again, what have we added? I can't tell the difference. I think we as Christians need to be aware that we are stewards of this earth, and we need to be very careful with how we take care of the earth. Remember who the earth belongs to. Who does the earth belong to? The earth is whose? It's the Lord's, right? The earth is the Lord's. In all its fullness, the world and all those who dwell therein, for he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the waters. We as Christians, above all people, should be concerned about our planet because this is not ours. This is my Father's world, and I'm merely a steward of it. So we need to be good caretakers of the earth. We don't need to fall into crazy extreme thinking, but we need to be very careful, is what I would say. Now, what about the Ice Age? Will there be another Ice Age? The answer, no. What caused the Ice Age? The flood of Noah. Will there ever be another global flood again? No. God has promised it. You don't have to worry about the Ice Age. What about global warming, though? If we're not going to have global cooling and an Ice Age, what about global warming? The answer is I don't know. I don't know where that ball of balancing is supposed to be. I don't know what effect humans have on it. But I can tell you this. One day there's going to be a warming beyond all warmings. One day it's not just going to be warming. It's going to be on fire. In 2 Peter 3:10, it says, but the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements, the atomic structure, will melt with a fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will all be burned up. And this not because of human environmental difficulties, this because of human sin. One day the earth and everything else we see around us will be gone. It will be burned up. The greatest of all the global warmings is coming when the Lord returns and this earth is reduced to ashes. Of course, there's a new heaven and a new earth, but this earth is not our home. We are just a passing through. Now, is there any hope with that doom and gloom about the earth? There absolutely is. There is hope. Man's sin is what caused the destruction of this earth, but it was by Jesus Christ that hope comes. In Romans chapter 5, verse 12, it says, therefore, just as through one man's sin entered the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men, because all of us have sinned. For if by one man's offense, that's Adam, death reigned through the one, much more, do you see those words? Much more, those who receive abundance of grace and of the gift of righteousness will reign in life through the one. And who is that? Jesus Christ. For as by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so also by one man's obedience many will be made righteous. Moreover, the law entered that the offense might abound. But where sin abounded, grace abounded much more. Amazing grace. We have it through the Lord Jesus Christ. Well, let's bow our heads and close our eyes. Every head bowed and every eye closed.